My own father stood up in that courtroom, pointed his finger at me, and told the judge I was a criminal. My mother sat beside him, smiling at her own daughter. They had hired the most expensive lawyer in the county, a man who charged more per hour than I made in a week, and his only job was simple: bury me, bankrupt me, make sure I walked out of that courthouse with nothing, not even my name clean. For 11 months I sat in silence and let them believe they had already won. I let them laugh. I let them tell the whole family I was a thief. I let my own brother stand in my grandmother's kitchen and call me a liar to my face, because I knew something they didn't. I knew exactly what my father had done. And I had the proof sitting in a folder that would end everything they built their entire reputation on. And on the final day, when the judge finally looked up from her papers and asked one single question, I watched my father's face turn the color of paper. My name is Emily Carter, and this is the story of how my own parents tried to destroy me in a courtroom, and how one question undid 30 years of lies. If stories about family, betrayal, and quiet justice speak to you, hit subscribe. Before we start, because you are going to want to see exactly how this ends. I grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, in a house that always smelled like cinnamon because my grandmother, Eleanor, was always baking something. She lived 2 streets over. From us, my whole childhood and some of my happiest memories are standing on a wooden step stool next to her, flour on my hands, learning how to fold dough the way her own mother taught her. My parents, Richard and Diane Carter, were what you'd call respectable people. My father sold insurance and my mother taught 3rd grade. On the surface, we looked like a normal, happy family. But underneath, there was always a hierarchy, and I was never at the top of it. My older brother Tyler was. Tyler was loud, confident, and charming in that way that made adults excuse anything he did. He was the quarterback in high school. He was the one my parents bragged about at church. He was the one who got the newer car, the bigger allowance, the benefit of every doubt. I was the quiet one, the one who got good grades and never caused trouble, which somehow made me invisible instead of appreciated. I used to tell myself it didn't matter. I used to tell myself that grades and hard work would speak for themselves eventually, and in a strange way, one person in my life always made me feel like I mattered exactly as I was. My grandmother, Eleanor. She used to squeeze my hand and say, "Emily, you are the one who pays attention, and one day that is going to matter more than anyone in this family understands." I didn't know back then how true that would become. After college, I worked in accounting for a mid-sized firm, and on weekends, I kept helping my grandmother at the small bakery she had built from nothing back in 1986, a little shop called Eleanor's Table. Tyler, meanwhile, went through 3 different business ventures that my parents quietly funded, and that quietly failed: a car detailing service, a fitness app, and something involving cryptocurrency that I never fully understood, and neither did he. Every time one collapsed, my parents said the same thing. "He's just finding his path, Emily. Not everyone learns the same way you do." I told myself I didn't need their validation. I had my grandmother, I had my career, and slowly I had my own small savings and a plan of my own. A modest condo I was saving toward, a life I was quietly building brick by brick while nobody was watching. Then, 3 years ago, my grandmother got sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3 by the time they caught it. I was the one who drove her to appointments. I was the one who sat with her during chemo, who learned to manage her medications, who slept on her couch during the worst nights so she wouldn't be alone. My parents visited on Sundays with flowers and left within the hour. Tyler visited twice in 8 months, both times to ask her for a loan. I never asked her for anything. Just showed up. Every single day I showed up. And in her final months, my grandmother made a decision that would eventually blow our entire family apart. Though none of us knew it yet, she rewrote her will. My grandmother passed away on a rainy October morning, and I was holding her hand when she went. 2 weeks after the funeral, we all sat in a lawyer's office to hear the reading of her will, and that is the moment everything in my family changed forever. Eleanor's table, the bakery she had built with her own hands over almost 4 decades, along with the building it sat in, and the majority of her savings had been left to me, not split evenly, not divided among grandchildren. To me, specifically by name, with a letter attached that the lawyer read aloud, where she explained in her own words that I was the one who showed up, the one who understood the value of quiet devotion, and the one she trusted to carry her legacy forward with integrity. Tyler received a modest sum, enough to be respectful, but nowhere close to what I was given. My parents received almost nothing beyond a few personal items. For about 4 seconds, there was silence in that office. Then my mother started crying, not tears of grief, but tears of pure shock and anger. My father's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood, the look right before he raised his voice. Tyler just stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "This has to be a mistake," my mother said. She wasn't thinking clearly at the end. The lawyer calmly explained that my grandmother had been assessed by 2 separate doctors for mental competency before signing the updated will, specifically because she anticipated this exact reaction. My grandmother, even in her final weeks, had been 3 steps ahead of all of us. I should have felt vindicated in that moment. Instead, I felt sick, because I could already see it in my father's eyes. This wasn't over, not even close. For the first few weeks, the silence was almost worse than yelling. My mother stopped answering my calls. My father sent one text that simply said, "We need to talk about this as a family," and then never followed up. Tyler posted vague things online about people who manipulate elderly relatives for money, and even though he never used my name, everyone in our extended family knew exactly who he meant. Then, the real campaign began. My aunt called me gently at first, asking if I had considered splitting the inheritance more fairly, for the sake of family harmony. A cousin messaged me saying my grandmother probably wasn't in her right mind near the end, and maybe I should just do the right thing. I started hearing secondhand that my mother was telling people at church that I had isolated my grandmother from the family in her final year, that I had convinced her to change her will while she was weak and confused, that I had basically manipulated a dying woman for financial gain. It was a lie, a complete, calculated lie. But it was working. People I had known my entire life started looking at me differently at family gatherings, whispering when I walked past, offering that tight, uncomfortable smile people give someone they've already decided is guilty. I tried to defend myself at first. I showed my aunt photos, messages, proof of the daily care I had provided. She just said, "Well, Diane says it was different," and I realized, then that facts didn't matter to people who had already chosen a side. There was one moment during those early months that still sits heavy in my chest whenever I think back on it. My mother invited me to what she called a family dinner, and against every instinct I had, I went, hoping maybe this was the beginning of them coming to their senses. Instead, I walked into a house where my grandmother's old china had already been divided up between my mother and Tyler's girlfriend. Pieces I recognized from 1,000 childhood breakfasts, now stacked in boxes labeled with names that weren't mine. When I asked about it, my mother said simply, "Well, someone has to be practical about these things, Emily." And I stood there in that kitchen realizing they weren't just angry about the will. They had already started dividing up a life that legally still belonged to me, as if my ownership of it was simply a formality they were waiting out. I left that dinner without eating a single bite, and I remember sitting in my car afterward thinking, this isn't grief anymore. This isn't even really about fairness. This is about people who believe they are entitled to things simply because they want them. That thought stayed with me for weeks, quietly reshaping how I saw every member of my family, one conversation at a time. And then, 6 months after the funeral, I received a letter that made my hands shake as I read it. It was from a law firm. My parents were suing me. The lawsuit claimed undue influence and elder manipulation. It alleged that I had isolated my grandmother, controlled her medications and appointments specifically to limit outside contact, and pressured her into changing her will while she was cognitively impaired. It sought to have the will invalidated and the estate redistributed according to what they claimed would have been her original wishes, which conveniently would have split everything between my parents and Tyler. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that letter 3 times. You should have shared it, Emily. You always think you're better than us because you're the responsible one, and now you think you deserve everything. This isn't personal, it's about fairness. It wasn't about fairness, it was about greed, dressed up in the language of justice. My father had hired a lawyer named Gregory Halston, a man known throughout the county for one specific skill: dragging out cases until the opposing party ran out of money to keep fighting. He wasn't hired because my parents believed they were right. He was hired because they knew I couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle, and they were betting I would fold before it ever reached a judge. I later found out my father had actually said this to Tyler, word for word, according to a message Tyler accidentally sent to the wrong group chat. We don't need to win the case. We just need to make it too expensive for her to keep fighting. Read that again. My own father's strategy was never justice, it was financial warfare against his own daughter. The lowest point of this entire ordeal came about 4 months into the lawsuit. My legal fees were climbing every single week. My savings were bleeding out faster than I could refill them, and I was still trying to run the bakery, keep my full-time job, and process the grief of losing my grandmother, all while being publicly branded a manipulator by my own family. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. I stopped sleeping properly. I would lie awake replaying every family dinner, every holiday, every moment I had ever felt like the overlooked one. And now, understanding that this wasn't a phase, it was who they had always been underneath the surface. The final blow came at a cousin's engagement party, which I almost didn't attend. But I told myself I wouldn't let them push me out of my own family completely. I was wrong to go. My father, 3 drinks in, cornered me near the dessert table in front of at least a dozen relatives. He didn't whisper. He wanted an audience. "You know what you are, Emily," he said, loud enough for the room to quiet down. "You're a thief who hid behind a sick old woman to steal what should have gone to your brother." Tyler laughed. Actually laughed, shaking his head like I was a punchline. My mother said nothing, which somehow hurt more than if she had joined in, because her silence was permission. I stood there in that room, surrounded by people who had known me my entire life, and not one of them said a word in my defense. I left without saying goodbye to anyone. I sat in my car in the parking lot and I cried harder than I had since the day my grandmother died, because in that moment I genuinely believed I had lost everything: my inheritance, my reputation, and my family, all at once. And then, somewhere between the tears, something shifted inside me, a quiet, cold clarity. If they wanted a fight, I was done being afraid of one. The next morning, I did something I should have done months earlier. I stopped trying to win back my family's approval, and I started building a defense based purely on facts. I contacted a lawyer of my own, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who specialized in probate and estate litigation, someone with a quiet, methodical confidence that immediately put me at ease. She listened to my entire story without interrupting once, and at the end she said something I will never forget. "Emily, from what you're describing, this isn't really a case about your grandmother's mental state. This is a case about your father's finances, and I think he knows that." That single sentence changed the direction of everything. Patricia advised me to formally request financial discovery, meaning if my parents wanted to argue that my grandmother's will should be overturned in favor of a more even distribution, then every financial transaction between my grandmother and any family member in the 2 years before her death was now relevant to the case. I remembered something small, something I had almost forgotten because it seemed unimportant at the time. During my grandmother's illness, I used to help her organize her mail and paperwork, and I remembered seeing several bank transfers to my father that she never explained. To me, along with a handwritten note in her recipe journal, a place she kept private thoughts alongside her recipes, that simply said, "Richard asked again, told him no this time, worried about what he's using it for." I hadn't thought much of it back then. I was too focused on her health. But now, with a lawsuit hanging over my head, I remembered exactly where that recipe journal was. I still had it. She had left it to me specifically, tucked into a box of her personal keepsakes. I called Patricia immediately and told her what I remembered. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Emily, I think we need to request your grandmother's full banking history for the 18,000 months before she passed, and I think you should bring me that journal." What we found over the following weeks was staggering. In the 18 months before my grandmother's death, there had been 11 separate transfers from her account to my father, totaling just over $94,000. Some were labeled as loans in the memo field, though there was no loan agreement anywhere, no repayment schedule, nothing formal at all. Others had no explanation attached whatsoever. My grandmother's recipe journal, it turned out, was far more than recipes. Scattered between handwritten notes for pie crusts and bread proofing times were dozens of small private entries, her real, honest thoughts written for no one but herself. Richard came by again today, asking about the business again, Diane called. Upset I won't co-sign anything for Tyler's new idea. Emily doesn't ask me for anything, she just shows up. I don't understand why that isn't enough for the rest of them. Told Richard no again today. He got angry, said I was being unfair to my own son. I told him I've given enough. Patricia and I sat together going through page after page, and what emerged was not the story my parents had been telling everyone. My grandmother hadn't been isolated, or manipulated by me. She had been quietly, persistently pressured by my father for money for over a year, money she eventually stopped giving him. And shortly after that refusal, she had changed her will. The lawsuit my parents filed against me wasn't really about protecting my grandmother's true wishes. It was, at least in significant part, an attempt to reclaim control over an inheritance my father may have already been financially dependent on, and to bury the paper trail that would expose exactly why she had cut him off. Patricia looked at me and said something I will carry with me forever. "Emily, your grandmother didn't just leave you a bakery. She left you the evidence to defend yourself, because somewhere inside she knew this day might come." We didn't rush to expose anything immediately. Patricia's strategy was deliberate and careful, the exact opposite of the chaotic panic I had been living in for months. We formally submitted the banking records and portions of the journal as part of discovery, meaning my parents' own legal team would eventually have to see them before the case proceeded further, whether they wanted to or not. We also requested testimony under oath from both of my parents regarding any financial transactions with my grandmother during that period, standard procedure that suddenly became a significant risk for people who had been telling a very different story to family and friends for months. stayed quiet the entire time this was happening. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell relatives what we had found. I let my parents keep believing they had the upper hand because Patricia had taught me something important. The loudest people in a room are often the ones with the least control over what happens next. Meanwhile, I kept the bakery running. I kept showing up every single day, kneading dough at 5 in the morning the way my grandmother had taught me. And every batch of bread I pulled from that oven felt like a quiet act of defiance against people who thought I would simply give up and walk away. Word started to spread through the family anyway, not because I told anyone, but because my father's attorney had to formally request additional time before depositions, citing new financial documentation that needed review. Lawyers talked to secretaries, secretaries talked to spouses, and eventually my aunt called me, her voice noticeably different from before. "Emily, is it true there's something about your father? And money?" I simply told her, "Everything will come out in court, and let the silence do the rest." The final hearing took place on a cold February morning, almost a year after my grandmother passed away. The courtroom was fuller than I expected. Several relatives had come, including the same aunt and cousin who had once questioned my honesty, now sitting quietly, uncertain of what they were about to witness. My father sat beside his lawyer, Gregory Halston, sharp suit, confident posture, the same expression he'd worn my entire childhood, right before delivering a lecture I hadn't asked for. My mother sat beside him, and Tyler sat one row back, arms crossed. Gregory opened strong, painting a picture of a devoted family blindsided by a calculated granddaughter who isolated an elderly woman during her most vulnerable months to secure a fortune for herself. He used words like manipulation, isolation, and undue influence, repeating them like a rehearsed rhythm designed to plant doubt in the judge's mind. Patricia let him finish completely without interruption. Then she stood, calm as ever. She then walked the judge through the banking records, transfer by transfer, date by date, alongside corresponding entries from my grandmother's own private journal, in her own handwriting, describing repeated requests for money from her son, and her growing concern about how persistent and pressuring those requests had become. I watched my father's confident posture begin to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, a slight straightening, a tightening around his eyes. Patricia then formally introduced her request for his financial records to be reviewed under oath, standard procedure in a case built on claims of financial impropriety, but procedure that suddenly felt like a trap closing shut in real time. Gregory objected, calling it irrelevant to the central claim. Patricia calmly replied, "Your Honor, my client is being accused of manipulating a woman for money. I believe it's entirely relevant to understand who else in this family may have already been doing exactly that." The judge, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Judge Marilyn Ostrander, had been quiet through most of the proceedings, taking notes, occasionally glancing up over her glasses. But after Patricia finished laying out the financial timeline, the judge set down her pen, folded her hands, and looked directly at my father. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm enough to silence the entire room, "I have a question for you, and I'd like a direct answer." The room went completely still, even. Gregory Halston, who had an answer prepared for everything, sat frozen beside his client. "If your daughter manipulated your mother into changing her will due to isolation and impaired judgment," the judge continued, "can you explain to me why bank records show your mother continued issuing you personal transfers, sometimes as recently as 2 months before her death, and why her own private journal describes those requests as persistent, and her decision to eventually refuse them as, in her own words, something she felt she had, quote, given enough?" The silence that followed felt like it lasted an entire minute, though it was probably only seconds. My father opened his mouth, closed it, and looked toward Gregory, who had nothing to offer him in that moment. No objection, no clever legal maneuver, because the question wasn't really a legal technicality. It was simply the truth, asked out loud, in a room full of people who had spent a year believing a different story entirely. I watched my mother's hand slowly move to cover her mouth. I watched Tyler shift in his seat, staring at the back of my father's head like he was seeing him for the first time. Finally, my father said quietly, "Those were just loans, Your Honor, temporary, between family." The judge simply replied, "Then perhaps, Mr. Carter. The isolation your family is alleging happened in this case wasn't Emily isolating your mother from the family. Perhaps it was your mother finally protecting herself from part of it." After that moment, the case moved quickly toward its conclusion. Faced with financial records that directly contradicted the entire foundation of their claim, and with my grandmother's own private, undated, unbiased journal entries corroborating every transfer, my parents' legal team requested a private conference with the judge. 20 minutes later, they withdrew the lawsuit entirely. No settlement, no partial concession, a full withdrawal, which under the circumstances was as close to a courtroom confession as we were ever going to get. Judge Ostrander, before formally closing the matter, added one final note for the record, stating that the court found no credible evidence whatsoever supporting claims of manipulation or undue influence by Emily Carter, and that the original will, as written by Eleanor Carter, would stand entirely as intended. I didn't celebrate in that courtroom. I didn't smile or gloat. I just sat there, exhausted, feeling something between relief and heartbreak, because winning didn't undo the year of whispers, the party where my own father called me a thief in front of family, or the silence from my mother while it happened. Outside the courthouse, my aunt approached me, eyes red, and quietly said, "I'm so sorry, Emily. We should have asked more questions before believing them." I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it. But I also knew that some relationships don't simply reset just because the truth finally came out. Tyler tried to approach me in the parking lot, started to say something about not knowing the full story, and I simply said, "I know," and got in my car because I wasn't ready, and I didn't owe him closure on his own guilty conscience that day. In the months that followed, life didn't magically become perfect, but it became honest, which turned out to be worth far more. My father and I have spoken exactly twice since that hearing, both brief, both strained, and both entirely on my terms regarding what I am and am not willing to discuss. My mother sent one letter, an apology. That felt more focused on preserving her own image within the family than genuinely reflecting on what she allowed to happen. And I have chosen, for my own peace, not to respond yet, if ever. Tyler and I have slowly, carefully begun speaking again, mostly small conversations, mostly him admitting in his own clumsy way that he let jealousy and convenience blind him to what was actually happening, and I'm giving that relationship space to either grow honestly or stay exactly where it is. Sometimes I think about that dessert table at the engagement party, the one where my father called me a thief in front of a room full of people who once knew me as the reliable one, the dependable one, the one who never gave anyone a reason to doubt her. I think about how none of them said a word in my defense that night, and how, for a long time, I let that silence define what I thought I deserved. I don't carry that shame anymore. I carry the memory of it, because I think it's important to remember exactly how low people can push you before you decide to stand up for yourself, but I no longer let it decide how I see my own worth. Eleanor's table is thriving. I expanded the seating area last spring, added her original cinnamon roll recipe back onto the menu after years of it being retired, and on slow mornings I still find myself talking to her a little, telling her about the small daily wins, the way she always wanted to hear about even the ordinary parts of my life. I used part of the estate to set up a small scholarship in her name at the community college for students studying small business management. Something I know would have made her prouder than any courtroom victory ever could. The legal fees nearly broke me financially before that final hearing, but Patricia and I worked out a payment plan, and slowly, month by month, I've rebuilt not just my savings, but something steadier underneath it, a sense that I can survive being doubted by the people who were supposed to believe in me first. What I learned through all of this wasn't really about money, or business, or even the inheritance itself. It was about the quiet difference between people who show love through presence and people who only show up when there's something to gain. My grandmother saw that difference clearly, long before any of us did, and she made sure, even from beyond her final days, that the truth would eventually have its own voice in that courtroom. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: being the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who simply shows up without asking for recognition, can feel invisible for a long, long time. But quiet effort isn't the same as weakness, and integrity has a way of holding its ground long after loud accusations burn themselves out. My parents hired an expensive lawyer hoping to bankrupt me into silence and submission. Instead, one honest question from a judge who simply wanted the truth undid an entire year of lies in less than a minute. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud, dramatic, or even intentional. Sometimes it's simply refusing to disappear, staying patient, staying honest, and trusting that the truth, given enough time and enough room, will always find its way to the surface. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, made you angry, or made you think of someone in your own life who taught you the true meaning of showing up, let me know in the comments below. And if you want more real stories about family, justice, and quiet